The lesser-known candidate is presented by the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA, a law firm representing the disabled in Social Security and VA compensation claims. If you need an attorney to assist you with a Social Security or VA compensation claim, call the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA at 1-800-875-8064 or send an email to info@ssalawyers.com. And now, back to the lesser-known candidate. David was met at Newark International Airport by a limousine driver who transported him to Freehold. Rocky had arranged for David to stay at the American Hotel, a historic landmark which was established in 1824. The most famous visitor to the hotel was Abraham Lincoln, who stayed there on his way to the White House in February 1861. The hotel had been closed for several years and was renovated and modernized by the new owners. Although the American Hotel had a restaurant, Rocky insisted they meet and eat at Federici's, another Freehold landmark. Federici's was famous for its New York-style thin crust pizza, the type you fold and watch oil drip down your sleeve when you try to eat it. Federici's had been around since 1921, owned by the same family for 4 generations. The restaurant was located on Main Street, right next to the American Hotel. Rocky was accompanied by his wife of 40 years, Alana. She graduated from college with a degree in finance, but for the most part, she was a stay-at-home mom, raising their 3 children and working part-time in the business. After some small talk, Rocky and David began discussing the campaign strategy. David explained that the delegate selection plans of some states made it easier to attain ballot access than others. Furthermore, some state delegate plans were restricted by the laws of their states. David suggested they first look at the easiest to attain ballot access and the deadlines to comply with the state plans. For example, to get on the ballot in Colorado only required a candidate to pay a $500 filing fee. For Arkansas, a candidate must pay a $2,500 filing fee. Idaho requires a filing fee of $1,000, Louisiana $750, Missouri $1,000, Montana $1,740, New Hampshire $1,000, Oklahoma $5,000, Texas $2,500, Utah $500, Vermont $2,000, and West Virginia $2,500. For $18,490, a candidate can get on the ballot in 11 states, said David. In other states, you can get on the ballot by collecting petitions. You are at the mercy of the state party or the state secretary of state in some states. In those states, they determine whether you are a nationally recognized candidate, and if not, they can leave you off the ballot. In addition to paying the filing fee, there are forms to fill out, and you must get Democratic voters in each of those states to agree to be your delegate if you get enough votes to qualify for delegates. David Bernstein explained to Rocky that there were companies that were in the business of collecting petition signatures. They were basically mercenaries. They would collect signatures to place constitutional amendments and political candidates on state and local ballots. They did not care about the issue or the candidate. You would simply pay them a fee and they would collect the signatures. It is easier to collect signatures for popular candidates and causes, said David. So the more difficult it is to get a signature, the more it's going to cost. For example, if Governor Don Santos from Florida needed signatures, they would be easy to get, so he might only have to pay $3 a signature. To get someone to sign a petition to get Rocky De La Grande on the ballot is going to be more difficult. People will ask questions about who this guy is, and many will refuse to sign, even though the petition only says they are okay with his name appearing on the ballot. You may have to pay $10 or more per signature, David advised. However, if you have the money, they will get the signatures. David gave Rocky a list of signature collecting companies. He also asked him to allow him to contract with people in each state to ensure he was able to get on the ballot. The last thing Rocky and David talked about was fundraising. Although Rocky could easily afford to pay the filing fees and hire people to get him on the ballot, to give his campaign at least the appearance of some legitimacy, he decided he would need to raise some funds. David advised Rocky that there was a federal law that was enacted in an attempt to give lesser-funded candidates a chance to compete. The way it worked was if a candidate for president was able to collect at least $5,000 in increments of no more than $250 per person in campaign contributions in 20 states, the candidate would be eligible for federal matching funds. No kidding, said Rocky. Are you telling me that every candidate for president gets money from the government? Well, not exactly, said David. To get matching funds, the candidate has to agree not to raise and spend over a certain amount, and most, if not all, major contenders will not do that. Rocky's wife, Alana, then spoke up. I know how we can raise $5,000 from 20 people in New Jersey, no problem. We have 20 family members who will give you $250. Maybe we can get your friends in the car dealership association to give you money. Rocky replied, I doubt it. They're mostly Republicans. So what? His wife said. They know you aren't going to win. Besides, they owe you for all the work you've done for the association. Rocky then said, If I went to a state and announced I was having a fundraising party and asked for $250 per person who attended, no one would show up. But what if I brought along a future Hall of Fame baseball player with the Yankees and told them they could get his autograph and take their picture with him? I bet we could easily get 20 people to show up. We could start next summer. Adam George would do it for me. If we held the event in a city where the Yankees were playing that day, every city has Yankees fans. In some cities, when the Yankees play, there are almost as many Yankee fans as home team fans. Since he'll be there anyway, it won't be a big deal. That's a great idea, said David. Candidates use surrogates all the time to raise money. How many times do you see an invitation to a fundraiser for a local congressional candidate, and then the invitation indicates a better-known elected official will also be attending and speaking? Instead of a politician, why not use a baseball star? Rocky advised he would talk to Adam George and get back with David to confirm whether he would do it. The meeting concluded and David went back to his hotel room. That night, David couldn't sleep well. He thought to himself, what if the economy is doing poorly? What if the president does something really stupid, but not stupid enough for other Democrats to challenge him for the nomination? As it stands, no well-known Democrat is going to challenge an incumbent Democratic president for the nomination. Rocky might just get enough votes in a few states to enable a couple of delegates to attend the Democratic National Convention and pledge their support. If Rocky could get some delegates, maybe the media would give him some coverage and he could talk about all the problems with the Social Security and Veterans Disability programs. David picked up his iPhone and clicked on his Facebook icon. He was going to search Facebook for pages of Democratic clubs and committees, but got distracted. He sent some greetings to Facebook friends who had birthdays. He then looked at posts from friends from college and high school showing pictures of their grandchildren, vacations, pets, and food they had cooked. While scrolling, David noticed there were clips of comedians on his Facebook page. He would often click on the video and watch the segment. The more he did that, the more clips would show up on his Facebook page. He knew that Facebook used an algorithm to figure out what people wanted to watch, but wasn't sure exactly how it worked or how it financially benefited Facebook. David believed that Facebook could access Google searches to determine user preferences. As an experiment, about a year earlier, David did a Google search using the phrase, "Do chimpanzees make good pets?" Besides getting hundreds of results warning that great apes do not make good pets, videos of gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and bonobos started showing up on his Facebook page. By the time David finished watching dozens of video clips of comedians and orangutans, he completely forgot about politics and was ready to sleep. President James Anderson and Vice President Cameron Graham were in the middle of their first term in office. The last election featured a crowded primary and no incumbent president was running for re-election. Anderson was not initially favored to be the nominee. He was a two-term governor of Virginia and was popular in his home state, but viewed as a moderate or centrist who would have a more difficult time persuading Democratic Party voters who tended to lean left, especially in the early primary states. He came in third place in the Iowa caucus and in fifth place in the New Hampshire primary, but he won South Carolina thanks to the endorsement by a long-term black congressman and placed second in the Nevada caucuses. Shortly after the South Carolina primary, Anderson began picking up endorsements from party leaders and other candidates started dropping out of the race. Toward the end of the primary, his remaining opponent was Cameron Graham, or Cam Graham, a senator from New Hampshire. Apparently, because his nickname and last name rhymed, Cam Graham, it was easy for people to remember him, which was not a huge deal, but it did help. Anderson and Graham struck a deal that Cam would drop out of the race and run for vice president as Anderson's running mate. Anderson cruised to victory in the general election against a divisive right-wing conservative governor from Georgia. 2 years into his presidency, Anderson's popularity had plummeted. He had mishandled the withdrawal of troops from Syria, resulting in the death of numerous Syrian civilians who had supported the United States during a recent conflict. The unemployment rate was climbing, and so was the national debt and trade deficit with China. With a Democratic House and Republican Senate, it was difficult getting any significant legislation passed. Anderson and Graham were meeting with their top political aide, Brian Greenberg, to discuss the presidential election coming up in 2 years. Anderson had already announced he would be seeking re-election and that Cam would again be his running mate. He wanted to make sure that he would be unopposed in the primary. The three agreed that the best way to ensure this would happen is to get the Democratic National Committee to change the primary schedule so that South Carolina held the first presidential primary election. The president suggested that a memo be prepared, addressed to the Democratic National Committee, recommending the change because the South Carolina electorate was more representative of the diversity of America and the Democratic Party than states such as Iowa and New Hampshire. In truth, the president was concerned that a left-wing liberal Democrat in a caucus in Iowa and primary in New Hampshire could possibly get enough votes to be awarded delegates or possibly beat him. With a solid win in South Carolina, he would have unstoppable momentum and he could easily secure the nomination and focus on the general election. The memo was sent to the Democratic National Committee, and the Rules and Bylaws Committee in their December meeting voted to recommend a change in the primary schedule, with South Carolina to be the first state to hold a presidential preference primary. To ensure no other state tried to jump ahead, they voted to reduce the number of delegates awarded to a state that conducted a primary prior to South Carolina, and any candidate that actively campaigned in such a state would not be allowed to participate in any primary debate. As an additional bonus to the president's strategy, unlike New Hampshire, where anyone could pay $1,000 and have their name placed on the presidential primary ballot, the filing fee in South Carolina was $20,000, and even then, it did not guarantee ballot placement. This would discourage political gadflies from entering the race and possibly picking up delegates. In the 2016 Democratic presidential primary in South Carolina, in addition to Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, a businessman, Willie Wilson, was able to get on the ballot along with Martin O'Malley, who had already withdrawn. Hillary Clinton received about 75% of the vote, and Bernie Sanders got around 25%. Willie Wilson garnered 1,314 votes, or 0.35%. With two major candidates in the race, the chances of an unknown candidate getting enough votes to qualify for delegates was nil. However, the president was concerned that an obscure challenger getting over 15% of the vote against an incumbent president would be a huge embarrassment. He had to make sure there were no Willie Wilsons placed on the South Carolina Democratic primary ballot this time. Shortly after the announcement of the change in the Democratic primary schedule, Rocky called David to discuss their strategy. David suggested that Rocky brush up on the structure of the government and the Constitution, as it was common for the media to try to make lesser-known candidates look uninformed by asking them questions which they feel presidential candidates should know. Let's start with the cabinet. I've seen where they've asked candidates who is in the cabinet, advised David. I give my students acronyms to try to help them remember. Try to remember this. A 4-H Agile veteran got STD, you see. The 4-H stands for Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, and Homeland Security. Agile with a J is Agriculture, Justice, Interior, Labor, and Education. VET is Veterans Affairs, Environment, and Transportation. STD is State, Treasury, and Defense. C is also the letter C, which is for Commerce. The last position on the cabinet is Vice President. There are a total of 15. You're going to need to read up on what each agency is responsible for, but this is a good way to remember. Another question they often ask is for you to explain the Federal Reserve Board and its functioning. This is difficult because even experts have a hard time explaining the Federal Reserve Board. I know you studied economics in undergraduate school, but let's go through this because you know it's going to come up. Let's start from the beginning. Before the United States came into being, the 13 colonies had a loose association under the Articles of Confederation. In the 1780s, people living in the colonies were facing poor economic times. The paper money issued by the Continental Congress was basically worthless. Senator Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton pushed for a national bank to pay for the debts of the War of Independence and to deposit and spend government money. A national bank was opposed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. After a debate, the Congress established the first national bank of the United States, and the law establishing the national bank was signed into effect by George Washington. The first national bank was chartered for 20 years. It was not renewed when it expired in 1811. By that time, Congress was controlled by the Republican Democrats who felt that the national bank was too powerful and possibly unconstitutional. As a result of the War of 1812, the country was again in debt. Tax revenues went down and the cost of goods went up. Although initially Madison had opposed the national bank and felt it was unconstitutional, he supported the second national bank because he believed it was needed to raise money and to pay war debts. In 1816, Congress approved the Second National Bank's establishment, which went into effect with a 20-year charter beginning in 1816. The southern states opposed the national bank. They sensed the national bank was too powerful and favored northern interests. To discourage the national bank from being in Maryland, the state of Maryland imposed a tax on the national bank branch in that state. The bank refused to pay the tax, asserting that the state did not have the authority to tax a federal entity. A lawsuit ensued. The case is known as McCulloch v. Maryland. In that case, the Supreme Court held that the national bank was constitutional under the Necessary and Proper Clause of the Constitution, and that under the Supremacy Clause, the state could not tax the bank. The decision was rendered by Justice John Marshall. In 1828, Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams for president. Andrew Jackson opposed the federal bank, and John Quincy Adams supported it. Jackson defeated Adams. Afterwards, he took federal money out of the federal banks and put them in state-chartered banks. This hurt the national bank, causing it to shrink in size and power. Before the charter of the Second National Bank expired, Congress authorized a recharter of the National Bank. Jackson vetoed the act, and Congress did not override the veto. As a result, the Second National Bank ceased to exist in 1836. There was no national bank from 1836 to 1863. State banks could operate if they deposited government bonds with state auditors and redeemed their notes in specie or gold or silver coins. In this system, notes were sold at a discount based on the distance from the bank and perceived soundness of the bank. There were a lot of periods of inflation and recession during this time frame. In 1863, Congress established the national banking system. The banks could choose either a national or state charter. If national, they had to issue government-printed bills that were backed by federal bonds. Between 1863 and 1907, there was a banking panic at least every decade. Depositors would learn a bank could not meet withdrawal requests, and this resulted in a run on the bank. Depositors in other banks would fear that this would happen to their bank, and otherwise solvent banks would fail as well. There was a severe depression in 1893. In 1907, there was another severe depression which led to a commission to establish solutions to the nation's banking and financial problems. In 1913, the federal bank was established. It was agreed that it would not be a private lender, its profits in excess of costs would go to the U.S. Treasury, and they would handle U.S. payments and tax receipts and act as a clearinghouse for financial transfers and checks. The founders wanted the bank to be decentralized and set up 12 branches operating independently with an oversight board in Washington, D.C. In between 1913 and 1929, there was fairly steady growth in the economy. In the late 1920s, the Federal Reserve thought the economy was growing too fast, so they raised interest rates. This resulted in a slowdown in the economy, leading to the Great Depression between 1930 and 1941. Part of the problem, which resulted in the Great Depression, was that during and shortly after World War I, there was an increased demand by Europe for agricultural goods from the United States. When Europe recovered, farm prices went down. Private banks kept lending money because of the profits they were making, and the Federal Reserve did not raise rates or rein in the banks. When the stock market crashed, it was too late. The Federal Reserve reduced interest rates, but it was too little to save the economy. President Hoover and Roosevelt tried to kickstart the economy with public works projects. The projects helped fix government infrastructure, but did little to help the economy. As an aside, the most significant program that came out of the Depression was the Social Security Act, which was passed in 1935. It was at first designed to provide income to older workers who contributed Social Security taxes into the program. World War II forced the government to spend money to produce ammunition and weapons. It was forced to spend a lot of money. The government had to sell war bonds. The bonds were purchased by the public and the Federal Reserve Board. This resulted in money flowing into the economy. To prevent price increases, the government rationed scarce commodities. Because the economy was geared toward wartime production, once the war ended, economists feared high unemployment. However, because of rationing and people being encouraged to save, Americans had money to spend and the economy flourished after the war. One of the major industries that caused the economy to grow was the automobile industry. At this point, Rocky interjected. My father saw this coming. That's when he bought his first automobile dealership. Another major factor which spurred economic growth was the Highway Act of 1956, which built federal roads linking all parts of the country. In the 1950s, the national debt was between $257 billion and $285 billion. It went from 86% of gross domestic product to 55%, so while the national debt was high, growth was faster. Prior to 1951, the U.S. Treasury could exert pressure on the Federal Reserve to set interest rates. After 1951, the Federal Reserve set interest rates independently. In the 1960s, the debt fueled by the Vietnam War rose, but the economy also grew. The debt to GDP ratio was only around 30%. However, because of wartime spending, higher oil prices fueled by the Yom Kippur War and the Arab oil embargo, and a crop failure in 1972, there was both inflation and a recession. This was known as stagflation. In 1973, the Federal Reserve had a dilemma. The oil embargo and resulting higher fuel prices were out of their control. If they lowered the interest rates to help the economy, inflation would get worse. If they increased interest rates, the economy, which was already hurting, would suffer worse. Prior to 1973, it was generally thought that there was an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Even today, you hear about the Federal Reserve raising interest rates to contain inflation and unemployment in the same breath. This theory was known as the Phillips curve. In 1973, this theory was debunked. We had high inflation and high employment. From 1974 to the 1980s, the Federal Reserve focused on non-monetary factors for inflation such as government budget deficits, geopolitical crises, and environmental factors. It kept interest rates relatively low to prevent slowing the economy even more. During the Ford and Carter administrations and in the beginning of Reagan years, inflation was between 5% and 10%. There were 3 recessions between the mid-1970s and 1980. In 1983, the Federal Reserve raised the interest rate. This resulted in a slowdown of inflation while the economy stabilized. In the 1990s, when Clinton was president, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates relatively high. The country still experienced economic growth with low unemployment. We even had a budget surplus during the last years of the Clinton administration. In 2001, when George W. Bush was president, shortly after the 9/11 attack, the country faced a significant recession. Bush and Congress cut taxes, expanded the Earned Income Tax Credit, and the Federal Reserve lowered the interest rates. This seemed to work and the recession was short. The economy was expanding and interest rates were relatively low until the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. In 2007, banks were lending money to everyone, and because housing prices kept climbing, it appeared that the loans were safe. A lot of these loans were high risk. When borrowers defaulted on loans, housing prices sank, which caused even more defaults and unemployment, and when the dust cleared, the stock market lost half its value and major financial institutions collapsed. The government passed several stimulus packages bailing out the financial, insurance, and automobile industries. This was known as quantitative easing, where central banks would purchase assets such as government securities and corporate debt. There are several schools of thought on quantitative easing. One is that it was necessary to keep the economy from collapsing, resulting in a long depression. The other school of thought was that the Federal Reserve and the government should have just left the banks, insurance companies, and other big institutions to fail, and that it would teach them a lesson to be more prudent in the future. The latest financial crisis resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic. The Federal Reserve resumed quantitative easing measures by buying massive amounts of debt securities. The federal government expanded unemployment benefits and gave loans to businesses that continued to stay open and pay employees. As of 2023, the economy had rebounded, unemployment was low, and the Federal Reserve, in an effort to slow down inflation, had raised interest rates. David and Rocky agreed that Rocky needed to read and reread this material. It was complicated stuff and likely to be asked about by reporters. Here are some key terms that you need to be able to define or discuss. The Laffer curve, the Phillips curve, monetarism, Keynesian economics, free market economy, open market committee, quantitative easing, troubled asset relief program, or TARP, and money supply. I'm sure they are also going to ask you about the debt and the deficit. The national deficit is over $1 trillion this year. The debt is about $32 trillion. If you are asked about this, here's what I would recommend that you say. The amount of the debt does not matter, so much as the size of the debt in comparison to the assets of the United States. For instance, if you had a house worth $100,000 and owed $80,000 on it, if your neighbor had a house worth $1 million and owed $500,000 on it, who would be wealthier? Who would be in a better financial shape? Wouldn't that depend on the income of each person? With respect to the deficit, there are times when it's good to borrow and times when it is good to save. If you want to attend college or start a business, borrowing may be wise. But if you want to buy a boat or an expensive car and it's not in your budget, it would not be smart to borrow in order to buy it. So, if we need to spend money to help stabilize the economy, foster economic growth, or defend our country, it's okay to temporarily engage in deficit spending. With respect to the debt, if we have a national debt that is proportionally low compared to our assets and gross domestic product, and we have a plan to reduce the debt over time, then the debt is manageable. At this juncture, the debt is proportionately too high and the deficit spending is not necessary. If anything, there should be less federal spending to try to slow down inflation. Furthermore, increasing taxes for the very rich and closing loopholes for profitable corporations is a responsible way to reduce the deficit and debt. If they ask you where you would cut spending to reduce the deficit or debt, never directly answer the question. Just pivot and talk about something else. I'm not going to bombard you with homework right now, said David. Let's just do the cabinet positions and the Federal Reserve, and we'll work on some more later. Rocky Delagrande was brilliant at marketing and sales. He studied how the successful automobile dealerships advertised to consumers, attended seminars on sales techniques, and followed economic reports and news on a daily basis. He knew that car owner psychology was an important factor in convincing potential customers to buy a car and to buy one from one of his dealerships. Based on his experience with marketing automobiles, Rocky delved into the psychology of voting. He read a number of studies and articles, with most of them having consistent premises. The premises were that there were 4 primary influencers in voting behavior. The first influencer was anger. The theory was that anger at a particular group would increase the likelihood of voting, and voting for a party or person who is opposed to that group. The group could be an economic class, a profession, industry, race, or foreigners in general. Both Republican and Democratic politicians use anger effectively. The Republicans attack foreigners who cross our borders illegally. They tell voters that these illegal aliens commit atrocious crimes and attack people. They bring assault weapons across the border and sell them to criminals. They sell drugs to our children. They join violent gangs. The Republicans tell voters that the Democrats are complicit with allowing these violent illegal aliens to cross our border because they want them to become citizens and vote for them. The Democrats villainize multinational oil companies that are only concerned with profits and, if left unchecked, will make our planet uninhabitable by the end of the century. They attack the pharmaceutical companies for jacking up the price of life-saving medicine, making it unaffordable to millions of Americans. They claim the criminal justice system and police forces are racially biased. The second influencer is anxiety, and the third is fear. These two really go hand in hand. The Democrats say that if Republicans are elected, women will have no control over their own bodies, that important books will be banned from the libraries, life-saving medicine and medical treatment will be unavailable to millions of Americans who will die an untimely death needlessly, and unarmed and innocent black youth will be murdered by police officers. The Republicans tell us that Democrats want to raise everyone's taxes and spend their money frivolously, creating debt so high it will bankrupt the country. They want to poison the minds of our youth with brainwashing reading material, and they want to take away our citizens' rights to own a gun. The last main influencer is pride. Typical slogans are, "Make America Great Again," "We live in the greatest country in the world," and "American workers can compete and win against workers from any country, provided there is a level playing field." The Democrats will say how great our country is because the people rose up to abolish slavery, gave women the right to vote, created labor unions, enacted the Civil Rights Act, and forced government to recognize the right to marry whomever one chooses as a partner. The Republicans will say that America has the best economic system. America has the greatest military. America is the best country in the world to live, and that's why everyone tries to get into our country. American workers and American products are the best in the world. Americans know better how to handle their money than the government, and the government should just stop interfering. And America will continue to be the greatest country in the world as long as Republicans are elected. Rocky made some notes of things other Democrats have said about Republicans. The ones that stood out was that Republicans are trying to ban contraception. Republicans want to kick out immigrants, take health care from women, increase taxes on the middle class to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy, and end Medicare as we know it. Republicans are bribed by the oil companies to introduce a bill that would gift or sell them America's national forests, parks, and other public lands, and open them up for mining, drilling, fracking, and logging. Republicans want to abolish Social Security and VA health care. Rocky asked himself rhetorically how they could get away with saying things like that, which obviously are a gross exaggeration or simply not true. He knew the answer. The statements were crafted in such a way that no individual person was accused, and if an individual was accused, it could be argued that it was an opinion and not an assertion as a fact. Obviously, the Republicans have their own common phrases they used. The ones Rocky felt were most effective were, "American lives have been lost because Democrats failed to secure the border," "Democrats motivate attacks against our police and terrorism in our cities, threatening our way of life," and "Democrats are making IRS bigger than the Pentagon, the Department of State, the FBI, and the Border Control combined. Those IRS agents will come after you, not billionaires and big corporations." Rocky believed he could put together an ad campaign that would make people angry at the president, causing anxiety, put them in fear, and inspire patriotism. On the other hand, he was worried about the damage he would do, and in the end, he wasn't going to win anyway, so why do it? Rocky did not like to lose. He knew that nice guys finish last and winners do whatever it takes to win. He was conflicted. At the end of the day, Rocky decided that a mild version of anger, fear, and anxiety would be the way to go, with a large heaping of patriotism. David and Rocky had scheduled a Zoom call to discuss how the campaign was going and what the next steps were. "We need to work on getting you on the ballot," David advised Rocky. "I have a spreadsheet of each state and territory and the requirements, at least from the last election, as to how to get on the ballot." "The first thing you have to know is the structure of the Democratic Party," David informed Rocky. The Democratic National Committee is the parent organization with various committees. Each state, however, has a state committee, and each state has county or local committees. Every 2 years, county committees hold elections and elect county chairs and state committee persons. Then the county chairs and state committee persons elect state chairs and national committee persons. National committee persons then elect officers of the Democratic National Committee. The Democratic National Committee Rules and Bylaws Committee is responsible for adopting an overall primary election plan and rules, but each state and territory adopts their own delegate selection plan that must comply with national rules. Each state has different rules to attain ballot placement. Primary elections are conducted using state government election entities. There are laws in states where presidential primary elections occur which govern how a candidate can attain ballot placement. In states which hold caucuses, the state party determines ballot placement rule. Ballot placement and getting votes is not all that is needed to obtain delegates to the Democratic National Convention. The candidate must submit a statement regarding their candidacy and attempts to comply with affirmative action goals. If the rules are not strictly adhered to, the candidate can be denied delegates even if they could get enough votes to qualify for delegates. Some states are easier to get ballot access than others. I would start with the easiest states first. Let's start with Colorado, where the filing fee is $500. Next is New Hampshire, which is $1,000. That's 2 states for $1,500. To get on the ballot in Arizona, you just have to be on the ballot in 2 other states. Arkansas is $2,500. Louisiana is $750. Idaho and Kentucky are $1,000, but there's a caveat in Kentucky, so we'll get back to that. Mississippi is $2,500, Missouri is $1,000, Montana is $1,740, Oklahoma is $5,000, Texas is $2,500, Utah is $500, and West Virginia is $2,500. In theory, in 15 states, you can get ballot access just by paying the filing fee. That's the low-hanging fruit. Now for the medium-hard states. For Alabama, you need to get 500 petition signatures or 50 from each congressional district. In California, the Secretary of State determines if a candidate is nationally recognized. If you're on the ballot in 15 states, this shouldn't be a problem. Same with Connecticut, although their Secretary of State is a little stingier on who gets ballot placement. For Delaware, you need 500 petition signatures. In Georgia, the Secretary of State decides who gets on the ballot. Seeing that Georgia has a Republican governor and Secretary of State, they would love to see the president have some competition. Georgia should not be a problem. In Illinois, you need 3,000 signatures. In Indiana, 4,500 signatures. In Maine, 2,000 signatures. In Maryland, 3,200 signatures. In Massachusetts, 2,500 signatures. In Nebraska, 300 signatures, or the Secretary of State can determine that the candidate is nationally recognized. In Ohio, 1,000 signatures. In Oregon, 5,000 signatures, or the Secretary of State can determine the candidate is nationally recognized. In Pennsylvania, 2,000 signatures. In Tennessee, the Secretary of State can determine a candidate is nationally recognized, or you can get 2,500 signatures. And in Virginia, you need 5,000 signatures with at least 200 from each congressional district. So we have 8 states where you need to get between 300 and 5,000 signatures, and 5 states where the Secretary of State can put you on the ballot and probably will if you are on the ballot in 23 states already, so this takes us up to 28 states. Here are the caucus states. There usually is no or little filing fee for the caucus states. You got Wyoming, Alaska, Hawaii, Iowa, North Dakota. That's 5. Oh, and I almost forgot Nevada changed to a primary state, and there is no filing fee or petitioner requirements for Nevada. It brings the total to 34. Probably the second most difficult states to get ballot placement are the states where the party chair decides who gets on the ballot. There's an interesting dynamic here. Since the party is a private entity, in theory they should be able to determine who gets ballot placement in their primary elections. However, the party is utilizing the state to conduct their elections, and they may be bound by due process and equal protection clause of the Constitution. If they try to exclude you, even though you are on the ballot in over half the states, you could argue that you are being discriminated against because you are Hispanic and sue to force them to put you on the ballot. Suing the party is a double-edged sword, but in theory you could. Those states are Florida, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, South Dakota, Washington, and Wisconsin. That's 7 more states, and now we're up to 41 with 9 to go. After discussing the requirements for ballot placement, Rocky and David discussed campaign organization. I suggest we hire 12 campaign workers to focus on placement, said David. I would divide them up into either territories or by type of ballot placement. My vote would be by territory. We could use the Federal Circuit Courts of Appeals as a guide, as those circuits are generally contiguous and have an approximate equal population. For instance, the 9th Circuit is Washington, California, and Oregon. The 11th Circuit is Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. There are 11 circuits, but we also have the Federal Circuit, and that person can handle Washington, D.C., and the territories except Puerto Rico. We almost forgot the territories: Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. They all have delegates too. I think all of them have caucuses. We should hire an election lawyer or two to make sure we comply with election laws. We need a campaign treasurer and assistant treasurer. The Federal Elections Commission is a stickler about filing reports accurately and on time. We also need someone to read the election laws of each state, especially the ones dealing with signature gathering. The signature gathering companies should know the laws, but we can't take any chances. We don't want you to spend thousands of dollars collecting signatures only to have them thrown out or come up short because the signature gathering company did not do it right. David continued, "Okay, we got Rocky at the top of the organization. I am right underneath as the campaign director consultant, then 12 regional leaders, the 2 treasury people, and 2 attorneys. You need a couple secretaries and receptionists also. You're going to need to rent a small office, buy computers, phones, supplies, and spend money for travel, postage, website design, etc. This is going to cost at least $20,000 per month, not including the salaries. Then you have the cost of filing fees and signature gatherers. I'm figuring $10 a signature on the average, and we will need 13,500 signatures, so that's $135,000 and about $25,000 in filing fees. In order to have any sort of respectable campaign, you'll need to spend about $4.5 million. Are you sure you want to do this?" asked David. "Absolutely," Rocky responded. "And you know what? The government and avid baseball fans are going to pay for the whole thing." Rocky and Alana had 3 children. The eldest, Peter, was an accountant and lived in New York City. Their middle son, Miguel, worked with his father at the dealership. The youngest, Angela, was the mother of 2 boys and worked part-time at her son's school as a bookkeeper. Although Rocky had turned over much of the responsibility for the business end of the 7 dealerships to his son Miguel, he was still involved with advertising and promotions. A few days after his telephone conversation with David, Rocky met with Adam George about filming a new commercial. Adam didn't really need the money, as he was one of the country's highest paid athletes, but he played college ball with Miguel and was one of his closest friends. Rocky was a little embarrassed to approach Adam with his proposal, but he asked anyway. "Adam, I know this sounds crazy, but I have a favor to ask you. A huge favor." Adam was surprised. "Sure, what is it, Rocky? Do you need tickets to a game?" "No," Rocky said. "I've decided to run for president." Hearing this, Adam laughed and asked, "Of what? The dealership? The farm bureau? The Lions Club?" "No," said Rocky. "The United States of America." "You're right," responded Adam. "You are crazy, and to be honest, I like crazy people. So how can I help you?" "I'd like you to be a guest at fundraising dinners and sign autographs and let people get pictures taken with you," Rocky replied. "Rocky, I can't do that. I have spring training coming up and then the regular season," said Adam. "I have a plan," advised Rocky. "What I'll do is, when you have a game out of town, let's say Houston, I will go to Houston and set up a dinner or a breakfast at a nice restaurant. We will announce that I will be having a fundraising event and you will introduce me. I'll ask for a minimum contribution of $250 and limit attendance to 25 people. I only need you to be there for less than an hour. I'll get a place close to the ballpark or your hotel. I just need you to do this in 20 cities or about 3 times a month during baseball season." Adam George tentatively agreed with the proviso he would have to clear it with his agent and lawyers and of course the Yankees. After his meeting with Adam George, Rocky started working on his stump speech. It was difficult deciding the right amount of anger, fear, and anxiety to put in the speech. He figured the best place to start preparing was to watch old presidential primary debates. He spent the next 2 weeks watching primary debates at least 4 hours a day and taking notes. He wrote down phrases such as, "everyday working people," "saddling our kids with crushing debt," "we're all in this together," and "the middle class is shrinking and poor families are getting poorer." He wrote, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Rocky Della Grande and I'm running for president because our country is at a crossroads. We're facing an unprecedented crisis. This may be the most important election in your lifetime. The scientific community is virtually unanimous that climate change is real and it is caused by human activity. If we continue down the path we're heading, by the end of the century, the planet may be uninhabitable. I support the Green New Deal. We need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels and convert to sustainable, renewable energy. Under my plan, all our country's energy needs will be supplied by renewable carbon-free energy by 2050. In doing so, we will create 20 million high-paying new jobs. We need to fix our crumbling infrastructure. How many more bridges need to collapse? How many more trains need to derail? How many more children need to be poisoned by lead in their drinking water before we take action? I propose spending $5 trillion over 10 years to fix our roads, bridges, schools, railways, wastewater systems, and airports. Not only will this protect American lives, it will create millions of jobs for skilled laborers. Our country is also facing an attack on women's access to reproductive health care. Ever since Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court, many states have enacted laws that make it virtually impossible for a woman to obtain an abortion, even if the pregnancy was the result of rape, incest, or her life is at risk. We need a constitutional amendment protecting a woman's right to make her own reproductive decisions. America is the greatest and richest country in the world, yet we are far behind other countries in educating our children. Every child who shows the ability to succeed in college should be able to attend college, free of charge, and not be saddled with a lifetime of student loan debt. America is the greatest and richest country in the world, yet millions of Americans are uninsured or underinsured. No American citizen should ever be denied the health care he or she needs. I support Medicare for all and to allow Medicare to negotiate the price of drugs with pharmaceutical companies. America has the best workers in the world, yet we keep losing jobs to other countries such as China and Mexico. This is because of bad trade deals. This is because multinational corporations who have no loyalty to America, but who spend millions of dollars in electioneering, are writing our trade agreements. Free trade is good, but we must demand that other countries compete with us on a level playing field. Trade agreements must insist that workers in countries with whom we trade are paid a fair wage, have basic safety standards, and allow their workers to unionize. Furthermore, we have to demand that China stops manufacturing its currency and stealing trade secrets. Free trade must partner with fair trade. America is known as the home of the free, yet we incarcerate more people than any country in the world. Part of the problem is systemic racism. African Americans make up a far larger percentage of the prison population than their percentage numbers in the general population. African American youth are more likely to be victims of gun violence. African Americans should not have to fear for their lives every time they get pulled over for a routine traffic violation, but for many African Americans, that's the way things are. It's time for America to recognize that Black lives matter. At the end of the day, the root of our problems lies with our corrupt campaign finance system. Super PACs are raising money from the fossil fuel industry, big banks, insurance companies, and pharmaceutical corporations. Our corrupt campaign finance system is why the top 0.1% in our country own as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Rocky felt this was a good start, even though much, if not all of the speech, was plagiarized. The lesser-known candidate is presented by the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA, a law firm representing the disabled in Social Security and VA compensation claims. If you need an attorney to assist you with a Social Security or VA compensation claim, call the law firm of SSA Lawyers PA at 1-800-875-8064 or send an email to info@ssalawyers.com.